Welcome to the Prisoner's Dilemma Co-operators podcast, where we make a podcast exclusively for people who listen to podcasts at 1.5 times speed. I am Matt, one of your co-hosts, I guess, and with me are, as always, I guess,
Nick, who is the second of your co-hosts. I don't know if we should say always, as always, because if this goes on for 5 years, people might drop in and out. So temporarily, always, your co-host is Nick, and that leaves our final co-host,
Mike. And you, dear listener, are very welcome.
I thought we agreed we were going to call them readers.
You are correct, actually. Well, I mean, in this case, I hope that they will forgive us.
Yes, because our posteriors definitely tell us that they are more likely to read the transcripts.
Oh god, that's something I hadn't considered. How are we going to get this transcripted? I volunteer, not me, to do it.
There's some software for it.
Matt, you were saying you've got a job in machine learning. Can you just get some transcription software sorted?
Maybe. I wouldn't say that I already got a job, but I'm getting reasonably close to it.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Congratulations,
Thank you.
reader. You're seeing behind the curtain of what goes on here at the podcast.
And now we are going to talk about what goes on in front of the curtains. That is the Replacing Guilt series. And now we will talk about the post Replacing Guilt, hence the name.
So, something, I think it was Matt, you said in the chat earlier that there's a lot of setup in these blogs that we're doing today. I completely agreed with that. I mean, the blog series is called Replacing Guilt, and this entry is called Replacing Guilt.
Especially because this entry doesn't actually solve the problem, and neither do the next two entries. What it does is put you in the mind space to make it more treatable or more tractable, I'd say.
Yeah, and also, I guess, make the problems feel more visceral and more concrete.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It does make it very easy to identify when you're feeling feelings of guilt, as opposed to just feeling like other sad feelings, and actually even within guilt. So this blog post entry also talks about breaking guilt down from one big amorphous feeling into a couple of other feelings. Specifically in this one, a listless feeling of guilt, which is the vague feeling that you get when you're playing video games all day and you're wondering, is there more to life than this?
And it also explores the fact that it's not easy because it's so amorphous. That it doesn't really the fact that one feels bad does not help one into identifying what it is that is making them feel bad in the case of listless guilt. And in fact, if my co-hosts agree, I would like to take a short detour to talk about the difference between shame and guilt.
Absolutely.
Sure, awesome.
Okay, the reason for this is that Nate Soros in this post does actually touch a bit on shame, but he uses it as a synonym for guilt.
I guess not necessarily. In the first sentence there is, in my experience, many people are motivated primarily by either guilt, shame, or some combination of the two. So I guess he means that they are somewhat different, although maybe related.
You are correct, Matt, but he does speak a lot about guilt, but he doesn't speak a lot about shame. And the reason, I believe, is because shame is, in my experience, a primarily social emotion. You feel shame because others make you feel ashamed of something. And in fact, one can feel shame because they are more intelligent than somebody else. One may feel shame because of their sexual orientation. One might feel shame because they're doing better than other people. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And the perverse thing is that sometimes since shame is a social emotion, it's sometimes easier to identify what causes it. In this case of the tall poppy syndrome,
Can you just explain the tall puppy syndrome?
Yeah.
Okay, that person that sticks out the most gets cut down. In a field of poppies, as long as you're average or below average, you are not noticed. But if you are above average, you will stick out and get cut down by the side.
Yeah, I that does ring a bell now you've mentioned it. I feel like it's almost the opposite of the... Is it the Steve principle? Which is people get promoted. If they excel at a level, they get promoted, and up to the point that they don't excel anymore.
Yes.
Yeah, the Shirky principle. I guess that's it, or not? No.
The
Peter Pan principle.
Yes.
That's it.
It is Peter principle, so yeah.
Yes. The Shirky principle was that institutions try to maintain the conditions they were created to solve, because this is the reason for existence.
Yeah.
This it gives me a very foreboding feeling about COVID. But let's not digress about that.
We're only allowed one detour at a time.
All right. That's why I don't think that shame gets talked about by Nate in this series, because shame, even if it's even if it's something that I abhor as a concept, because one should not let shame dictate one's action, it's easier to solve. While guilt, being something that comes from within, you feel guilt because you feel that you are falling short of your ideals, is more important.
Would you say that the main difference between guilt and shame is that guilt is caused by not meeting your own expectations with regards to yourself, whereas shame is about not meeting other people's expectations? Or is there some more complex difference between the two?
No, that's pretty much it. You summed it up perfectly.
Okay, so would you say that guilt is basically internalized shame?
I don't know. I mean, it might be like shame, but shame coming only from yourself, from your homunculus, which does resonate with the next posts in this series, actually.
Yeah, also guilt is used in a slightly different context, in the religious context. Like if you did something against the will of God or gods or some other supernatural power that wants you to behave in a certain way, then this is causing you this feeling of guilt, and this thing called guilt. If you feel bad for it, and also it works like something like negative kind of karma.
And actually, this makes me think that Catholic and religious guilt bleeds into shame, because you feel, aside from your own self, that an external agent, God and the angels, are looking upon you and accusing you. In fact, there is the famous meme of God is always watching. Okay, there are many humorous variations, but there's also ceiling cat is watching you masturbate. And you shouldn't, because that would make you feel ashamed that he has to watch you do it.
Huh.
I didn't expect to see like a 15-year-old meme referenced on this podcast recording, but there we go. What we were talking earlier about, kind of obviously we're talking about replacing guilt and how would you go about replacing shame. I was going to say that replacing shame is probably easier because you can just get friends that don't shame you for, not believing in God or, acting a certain way. But obviously that's easier said than done.
Implying making friends is easy.
Yeah, and also, with regards to shame, if your shame is unsubstantiated in the sense that nobody thinks about you badly because you did something, but you think that they would think bad about you if they knew that you did X, then if you are an honesty-oriented person, you can just ask them about their opinion. And even if it turns out that you have mispredicted their opinion, then your shame basically should dissolve, more or less.
And also, having a high enough self-confidence insulates you against shame, because you can just say, oh, who cares about them? I know that what I did was correct. I believe in myself enough that I can confront their ideas and say, no, they're wrong.
Yeah. So before we move on, I guess I would like to bring up two more trivia with regards to the difference between guilt and shame. I heard at some podcasts, I guess there are a few episodes which feature this guy, Joseph Heinrich, who studies psychological differences between cultures, and he basically said something like that whereas Western culture is much more motivated by guilt, other cultures like Eastern cultures, but also basically everybody from outside this weird, which means I guess Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, which sort of encapsulates Western middle class, and that all of these non-Western, non-weird cultures are much more motivated and driven by shame than by guilt. But I'm not sure how he operationalizes this in his research, but it would definitely be interesting to look at. Also, by the way, too, in Polish, the guilt can be translated into two different words. One is Grzech, which refers basically only to the religious guilt, and the other is Wina, which is related to both your personal internalized feeling of guilt, but also of being found guilty of doing something like something prohibited or some crime. That's interesting that different languages split these concepts slightly differently.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with the shame and the two words for shame and having multiple words for the same thing in different languages. I feel a lot about that with love. That Greek has like 6 words for love, of like familial love and sexual attraction and things like that.
Yeah.
And
Our friend Basashin said that like he suffered a little from alexithymia, and which is the difficulty in naming your emotions, and when he learned Japanese, which has a much richer vocabulary for expressing your emotions, he found it very helpful for like talking about his mental state.
But this makes me think also, in Italian, shame is vergogna, while guilt is a more complex way of saying it, which is senso di colpa, but which is not used that much. And so the concept of guilt in Italian is, I believe it's not as pronounced.
Maybe.
Just to maybe bring us back to guilt rather than shame, although it is a good conversation. Was there anything else in the blog post replacing guilt you wanted to talk about?
Basically, the conclusion or like the moral of this post is that you should not. It would be highly optimal for you to try to remove guilt-based motivation entirely and replace it with intrinsic motivation, which is about being driven towards something rather than away from something. You can say the evolutionary function of guilt.
You should do what you want to do rather than not do what you're afraid of.
Yes.
Be motivated by like joy or pleasure rather than be motivated by fear or shame or something.
Yes.
There was a line as well where this listless guilt tends to be found in people who have fallen into the nihilistic trap. People who either believe they can't matter or who believe that no one can matter. So if that's you, dear reader, then this applies to you. But for me, and I think all of my friends, it's the opposite, that like we all think that everybody matters and their experiences matter, and we should do what we can to make them as good as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, when I suffered with listless guilt, which interestingly was in the general period when I first started getting interested in less wrong, the problem for me was also that my goals were very vacuous, were very abstract. I mean, I did have the general goal of get a degree and have good grades. But since I hadn't yet started tracking how much effort I put into studying, it was hard to tell whether studying in one way for an hour or studying in another way by reading the book by myself was better or worse. This makes me theorize that, the root of this cause is vagueness, that a lot of problems come from not starting, which is the important part, from not starting to chunk your life into discrete pieces.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
I think that's a good sort of take-home message from you, Mike. Matt, have you got one?
Maybe I would just rephrase what Mike has said, that, or put it in a slightly different context, that having even badly or in a not perfectly defined goals, but just some goals that are clearly defined and some clear direction in which you would like to move your life. In short term, it lets you learn a lot more about what you really care about and about what you specifically would like to do in your life, than just staying in this vague state of having very vague and blurry aspirations. So just trying very short term, like define even like haphazard goals. Just try different things.
Cool. And if I had to summarise this, I'd link it to in polyamory, there's a lot of discussion about jealousy for obvious reasons, and I think there's a lot of parallels between jealousy and guilt, and they're both almost they're a very internal feeling, but it's not an actual feeling that reflects the real world, the territory. You feel jealous because you feel like another person is going to act in a certain way, and the same way guilt is like you feel like you should be acting in a certain way. I just think, if there's any poly people listening, then poly A people listening, then they may appreciate that connection as well.
Do we have time for another digression?
Go on, we'll indulge you.
Thank you very much. Jealousy is, I believe, it has been found, I don't remember where, but there is a study somewhere, that jealousy is linked to OCD, to obsessive compulsive disorder. A person that suffers from extremely crippling jealousy can be treated with the same drugs that treat people who suffer from OCD. This makes me wonder, would guilt be able to be treated in this way? I don't think so, because a jealous person knows that their loved one is faithful, knows that their loved one is not secretly the town bicycle, but has to check anyway. The same way that a person who is compulsive needs to switch on and off the light 6 times before leaving a room.
That's a really interesting proposition, Mike. I don't know. When you were talking, I was sort of sitting with feelings of guilt, jealousy, and I didn't feel like they could both be treated by the same medication. It feels like they're coming in from different places and they're very different colours of feeling.
I just started to wonder, in what psychiatric conditions do people experience like pathological intensity of guilt? But I can't think of any.
It's an interesting idea though, and I had no idea that jealousy and OCD could be treated with the same medication. That feels like something that Scott Alexander would do a very long blog post about.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, in fact, I'm actually just did a very short Google. It might have a specific name, like obsessive jealousy or retroactive jealousy. The problem is repetitive thoughts. And this does also serve to give I have the word in Italian, not in English, but it does give credence to what you just said, that guilt is not a repetitive thought, it's more of a background thought, while jealousy is something slightly more structured. Like you need to already have a scenario in mind to be jealous of somebody, while instead with guilt, it's just like in post we're examining, is more a formless emotion.
See, that's interesting you say that, because I would find that when I feel guilty, it's quite a repetitive thought. Not to the point of, I'm unable to think of anything else, but it's a very common thing. If I have spent 3 hours watching TV and eating crisps, between every episode of TV, I'll be like, I should stop this and I should do something more useful.
Yeah, I would say that for me, guilt is something that more or less usually hums in the background with varying intensity, but occasionally it bubbles up and comes up on the surface and becomes very intense. Usually prompted by some external, like primed by something that I read or see. So it's like a little of the two.
Yeah. I mean, if you had to predict, it would almost certainly be a mix of the two rather than completely one or completely the other. But it's a good reminder that not everything's a binary. So the next blog post was called The Stamp Collector. It's a post about a hypothetical robot that collects stamps. Some philosophers find it very interesting. Then they realise it's a computer, and they hypothesise that it doesn't actually care about stamps. It just cares about maximising its internal stamp counter. And they talk about it in a bit more detail in the post, and then they say that they can actually access the software for the robot directly, and instead of giving it stamps, they just increase the stamp counter in its head, or they give it the option to get a stamp or increase the stamp counter, and the robot always goes to get the extra stamp rather than increasing the stamp counter in its head. And again, the blog post discusses that a little bit, and then it ends with another group of philosophers find humans who only care about pleasure. So that could be food, it could be sex, it could be anything, and they think, so pleasure is the primary motivator, and then they realise that some humans donate money to charity, and they hypothesise that the pleasure they receive giving money to charity is greater than the pleasure they would have received from food. And then a mother jumps in front of a car to save his child, and then the philosophers go off and philosophise. And I think the key point of it is saying that it's easy to look at humans to just be pleasure maximisers, but we're more complicated than that. But what did everybody else think?
This way of thinking about things may be like sort of natural for the author, but this post basically sounds a little bit like fairy tales or thought experiments which AI researchers and similar people tell to each other to illustrate certain points. So like it has a very specific audience which readers of this blog are not necessarily a subset. I guess once at a time when I discovered philosophy of objectivism when I was like 17 maybe, this kind of setting things this way kind of made sense, but I also think it's kind of always seemed a little too simplistic and wrong to me, and there's something missing from stating that a thermostat's purpose is not to regulate the temperature in the room, but just to bring the value sensed by its temperature sensor to the preferred range. It's missing the entire context in which the system is being deployed.
Yeah. In a way, the thermostat doesn't even know what heat is, or a central heating system or a boiler. It just only knows about the two numbers, that what it should be and what it is at the moment.
Well, I think it's also like regular people, because something I've been mulling over is that these three posts are very much set up for the rest of the series. But going back to our previous episode about half-assing it with everything you've got, the idea of having a fake goal that you have accepted from society feels like being a robot that instead of having the real goal of increasing the amount of stamps in the world, has the fake goal of increasing the stamp counter in its head.
I think about the, again, half-assing it with all you've got. If you've got an essay, society tells you should get 100% on the essay. But if that isn't what actually motivates you, what motivates you is passing, then, the points, the percentage score is the stamps. The stamps don't actually matter. It's what you want in your head, or what you want to do with the passing grade that matters.
Yeah, and in this term studies, like the system is like people with hypothalamus lesions who can't stop eating because they feel constantly hungry no matter how much they eat.
Yeah,
and extrapolating further, one can say that this post basically taking the steps towards telling the reader you have to actually have goals that are not simple, or rather that are as simple as they need to be, that is very complex.
But in this case, it is not the stamp counter in your head, but it's like the counter of how many points you are awarded by society.
That a lot of the problem of the mistake that the naive philosophers written by Soros did feels to me a bit like an argument over definitions. The fact that the philosophers are having an argument over the internal stamp counter and whether the stamp counter is the goal of the robot or not. I mean, the goal of the robot and the stamp counter inside the robot's head are things that might overlap, but in the end they're just words. One needs to look at the behavior of the robot.
Yeah, there was a bit near the beginning of the post where it says that they're trying to decide how the robot makes a choice, and they explain it using terms of choice. And there was a quote I pulled out, which was, in order to explain redness, you must explain it in terms of non-red things. I think that's just useful of you can't explain choice by saying, oh, it makes a choice.
This philosopher is saying that this robot works basically by trying to maximize the number in its stamp counter is a mysterious answer to a mysterious question. They are not new belief that they state, this new sort of discovery, quote unquote, does not in any way constrain our anticipations. Doesn't make us expect something else from the robot or from the behavior of the system in its computer. This is basically just trying to present the thing in a way that makes it sound like it was solved and it was simple, whereas it's not, and we are not in any way closer to solving how this robot works by saying that, oh, it's trying to maximize the number in the stamp counter in its head.
Yeah, it's almost circular answering of just like...
And in fact, the post itself has the philosophers invent the word of stampiness. That why stampiness is the robot's internal measure of how much taking a certain action would increase its stamp counter. That is, just like you said, a mysterious answer to a mysterious question.
And I also think that makes perfect sense to say that this number really is trying to maximize the number of stamps collected and is not trying to maximize the number in stamp counter if the state of its stamp counter is very closely entangled with the number of stamps that it has collected. That is, that it is really a strong evidence of how many stamps it has collected. There is very close connection between the two. There could be multiple links to posts in the sequences from the first part, because there was a lot of talking about that. So the third post is called "You're allowed to fight for something," and it starts from the statement that it's much easier to work with specific guilt than with listless guilt. And so if you want to eliminate guilt eventually replace it with positive intrinsic motivation, then you should start from making it specific, making it very sharp and detailed instead of vague and blurry, to make that you feel guilty because you are not doing something specific that you think you should be doing, instead of feeling there should be much more to this life, and I would like to do something else, something exciting, something meaningful, but I have no idea what it should be. The title of this post, "You're allowed to fight for something," refers to you care about the external world as long as you are driven by internal processes.
Yeah, he talks as well a bit earlier in the "You're allowed to fight something" that, I don't know, he's kind of attacking the nihilist viewpoint. I think he might almost go so far as say that the nihilist viewpoint is wrong. He has the analogy of you own a dog, and then somebody offers to mind wipe you that you ever had a dog, and they'll also pay you, that they'll take the dog and kill it and then give you $1. And obviously nobody would say, yes, I want that to happen. And yeah, so he is making the point that, okay, the vast majority of people would say that they wouldn't want the dog killed in exchange for $1, even if there was basically no negative side effect to it. And he says, use this as an intuition pump, and use this as a reminder that you do actually care about the world, and don't be a nihilist.
Yes, and my idea is connecting the thought to the stamp collector, that I'm sort of groping toward the concept, but I think that a lot of people do this to themselves, that they go through life by adopting as their own a goal that is not their goal, because it's easier to imagine themselves having that goal than imagining themselves having a complex goal. That is, when I was saying that some people would accept the $1 for having their dog killed and all their memories of the dog erased, well, it certainly feels like people like the ultra rich would do that. But what kind of people are the ultra rich? The ones who value money above all else. The people whose goal it is to have as much money as possible.
I wouldn't say that Elon Musk, for example, or Bill Gates value money above all else. But yeah, I get your point that in general, if money is your main objective, then you are also more likely to sacrifice anything for money. The more important money for you is, the more likely you are to do that.
I think you maybe hit the nail on the head when you said unreasonable sacrifices, and I think that's a very heavy sliding scale of, you know, how much money you have compared to what you consider an unreasonable sacrifice, because obviously the more money you have, the less sacrifice you'll want to make.
Yes, or maybe not having your dog killed, but certainly doing unreasonable sacrifices to save money. For example, doing a 2-hour commute every day in order to save money on rent on a place closer to your workplace. Yes, and there is the trope of the miser who will steal money out of the collection bin at church, or will keep using their clothes or their boots until they physically get destroyed. And that's the kind of behavior that I'm thinking of. A person that does have enough money but still behaves in ways that poor people do to save as much money as possible.
Yeah, that may be because spending money on things they would care about, or spending money on just on yourself, is associated in their mind with guilt and makes them feel guilty, or because they were conditioned to just try harder button whenever it's possible, because they learned that if you are really embody some virtue, like in this case the virtue of not spending more money than you like absolutely need, the more brownie points you get from society.
I guess I'll broadly agree with that.
So they are pushing themselves to be extreme with that.
Exactly.
And coming back to what I said at the beginning of discussion about this specific post, that it's easier to work with specific guilt, and so you would like to shift your guilt from listless to specific. The best way to start feeling guilty about something specific rather than about nothing very clearly specified is just to find something you want to fight for and something that you think will be worth fighting for. Then start working with that when you will truly internalize the thing that you want to fight for, then your guilt should really probably start being more about this specific thing that you would like to fight for, but you are not doing it.
And just as a warning, Nate actually says this type of guilt, though is often much more painful, is easier to address. So if you are joining us on this journey, reader, just be prepared that it may be more painful, this type of guilt, but yeah, we can hopefully solve it easier together.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a different emotions when you're binging Netflix or playing video games and things. I should be doing something. When on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're watching Netflix or playing video games and thinking, oh, I should be doing that.
It is easier to address though, because if you say, I need to be doing that, then you can just look at your to-do list and actually do the thing.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's the hard part.
There was just one thing he said as well, which is just a direct quote. Step 0 is believing that you can change the world or whatever it may be. And I don't know, I think a thought you might have immediately on that is, oh, but what can I do? You know, anything I can do would just be a drop in a bucket. But of course, what is a bucket other than a series of drops?
I mean, it also depends on what your goal is, because speaking for myself and only myself, even just planning out your life and deciding whether you want to have a family or not, that's already hard enough on its own. I mean, almost everybody does it, but that does not mean that it is easy, just that everybody does it. And I mean, it is also false that everybody does it. It feels as if everybody does it. Or building a career, or buying a house for your own, or being in a position where you're financially comfortable. Hopefully the next post will be cheerier. It feels a bit like these have been on a downward trend. But have faith in us, dear reader. We are going to go on the upswing. And in fact, the next couple of blog posts we're going to talk about are caring about something larger than yourself, and you don't get to know what you're fighting for. Now, I haven't read them yet, or I don't remember them correctly, but from the title alone, I do feel as though they're going to be much cheerier, if somewhat ominous.
I'd agree. If you have something to say about what we've been discussing today, you can probably find us somewhere online, or you can email us directly at prisonersdilemmacooperator's@gmail.com. That's all one word with no punctuation other than the at and the dot before the com.
So, as you remember, dear listeners, at the end of the last episode, we finished it with saying, what is true is already so, but maybe we can try a different mantra to bring headache to our producer. We could say, I can care about how the world is, and maybe this can become our Prisoner's Dilemma Co-operator's mantra.
Sounds good. I'm game to try it.
So, 3, 2, 1.
I can care about how the world
is.
Oh dear.
Yeah, okay.
I guess one day we'll get together in the mid-space and re-record all these episodes just to be able to say in synchrony, I can care about how the world is.
I think that we'll still be all together in mid-space and we will still be unable to synchronize.
But we won't feel guilty about not being able to get it right, and that's the important thing.
Of course not. Our thanks go to Nate Soares, who wrote the original series of blog posts.
Gianluca Truda, who turned them into a podcast.
The hosts of the Bayesian Conspiracy podcast, who have recommended this series.
And thousands of other units of hell that they have provided.
Thank you to the Council of the Guild of Servants, who encouraged us to produce this podcast.
And of course, thanks to you, the reader,